Jake Thompson cursed under his breath as his old cargo hauler shuddered and died in the darkness of space. The engine lights flickered once, then went out completely. His hyperdrive had been making strange noises for weeks, but he'd ignored it, like always. Now, he was paying the price. Through his cracked viewport, Jake could see the red surface of Kepler 44 to be spinning below him. Warning beacons floated around the moon like angry fireflies, broadcasting danger messages in every language known to the galaxy. Nobody landed on Kepler 442b, ever. The place was a graveyard, marked off limits by every space authority from here to the outer rim. But Jake didn't have a choice. His ship was falling, and this dead moon was the only solid ground for light years in any direction. He strapped himself in tight and prayed his old girl would hold together for one more landing. The crash wasn't too bad. Jake had made worse landings, on legitimate planets. His ship skidded across the dusty red ground, kicking up clouds of rust-colored dirt before finally coming to rest in a shallow crater. The hull groaned and settled with the sound of tired metal. Jake sat in his pilot's chair for a long moment, just breathing. He was alive. That was something. Outside his windows, the landscape looked like pictures he'd seen of old Mars before it was terraformed. Nothing but red dirt and rocks stretching to the horizon under a pale yellow sky. He grabbed his toolkit, an emergency pack, then stepped outside to assess the damage. The cooling system had taken the worst hit during landing. Coolant fluid leaked from twisted pipes like green blood. Without it working, his ship would overheat the moment he tried to restart the engines. Jake rolled up his sleeves and got to work. The repairs took hours. Jake had always been good with his hands, learned from his father, who'd been a mechanic on the outer colonies. But this was delicate work, and he had to be careful with his limited supplies. One wrong move, and he'd be stranded here forever. He was deep under the ship, wrestling with a stubborn connection, when he heard it. A sound that made his blood turn to ice water. It started low, barely audible, like the rumble of distant thunder. But it grew louder, deeper, until Jake could feel it vibrating in his chest and rattling his teeth. Something was growling out there in the mist. Jake froze, wrench still in his hand. The morning fog had rolled in while he worked, thick and gray, across the barren landscape. He couldn't see more than 20 feet in any direction. But something was moving out there. Something big. The growling stopped. Jake held his breath, straining to listen. Nothing but the whisper of wind across empty ground. Maybe it was just his imagination. Maybe the stress of being stranded was getting to him. Then he saw the eyes. 2 yellow lights floating in the mist, each one the size of a dinner plate. They hung there about 15 feet off the ground, watching him with the cold patience of a predator. Jake's hands started shaking. He knew those eyes. Every spacer in the galaxy knew those eyes. A shadow maw. The creature stepped forward, and Jake's worst fears were confirmed. The thing was massive, easily the size of a small building. Its body was covered in scales that looked like black armor, each one sharp enough to cut steel. Rows of teeth lined its mouth like broken bottles, designed for tearing and crushing. This was death walking on 4 legs. Shadow maws were legends in the worst possible way. They'd wiped out entire colonies, turned thriving worlds into ghost towns. The military had tried hunting them for decades, but the creatures were too smart, too fast, too dangerous. Most sectors just marked Shadow Maw territory as no-go zones and hoped the beasts would stay put, but this one was hurt. Jake could see it limping as it moved closer, favoring its left rear leg. Dark fluid dripped from wounds along its sides. Its ribs showed through torn hide, and those terrible yellow eyes were sunken with hunger. The creature stopped about 10 feet away and just stared at him. Jake knew he should run, should dive under his ship, or scramble into the cockpit. But something held him frozen in place. Maybe it was fear. Maybe it was the way the beast looked at him. Not with mindless rage, but with something almost like curiosity. Jake's emergency pack sat on the ground beside his tools. Without thinking, he reached slowly into it and pulled out one of his protein bars. The wrapper crinkled loudly in the silence. The Shadow Maw's head tilted slightly, tracking the movement. Every survival instinct Jake had screamed at him to stop. This was insane. You didn't feed apex predators. You ran from them. But looking into those hungry eyes, Jake saw something he hadn't expected. Pain. Loneliness. The same desperate emptiness he'd felt plenty of times himself. Drifting between jobs in the cold space between stars, Jake tossed the protein bar toward the creature. It landed in the red dirt, about halfway between them. The Shadow Maw looked at the offering, then back at Jake. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then the great beast lowered its massive head and sniffed the bar. Its tongue, black and rough as sandpaper, swept the food into its mouth in one quick motion. It chewed thoughtfully, never breaking eye contact with Jake. They stood there in the morning mist, man and monster, connected by the simple act of sharing food. Jake felt his fear melting away, replaced by something he couldn't quite name, when the Shadow Maw finally turned and disappeared back into the fog. Jake knew his life had just changed forever. He just didn't know how much yet. 3 weeks had passed since Jake Thompson's emergency landing on Kepler-4 for 2B, and his life had become something out of a bad joke. As his cargo hauler Lucky Strike approached Frontier Station's docking bay, he could see the usual bustle of activity through his viewport. Workers loading containers, mechanics servicing ships, traders haggling over prices. Just another ordinary day at one of the galaxy's busiest commercial hubs. That ordinary day was about to end. Jake's shadow had grown considerably since leaving the Red Wasteland. What started as a curious Shadow Maw, limping after his ship, had become a constant companion. The massive creature followed him through hyperspace jumps, like some kind of interdimensional pet, appearing wherever Jake's ship dropped out of warp. He'd started calling the beast Rex, partly because it reminded him of the ancient Earth predators he'd read about as a kid, and partly because the creature seemed to like the name. Rex had an uncanny ability to stay hidden when Jake needed privacy, but the moment his ship approached any populated area, the Shadow Maw would materialize like a dark guardian angel. Today was no different. The docking control tower cleared Jake for Bay 17, same as always, but as the Lucky Strike settled onto its landing struts, a shadow fell across the entire platform. Rex emerged from behind the ship, stretching his massive frame like a cat waking from a nap. The creature was even bigger than Jake remembered, easily 40 feet from nose to tail, with those midnight black scales gleaming under the station's harsh lights. The reaction was immediate and predictable. Dock workers dropped their equipment and ran screaming toward the nearest exits. Cargo loaders abandoned their vehicles and sprinted for cover behind shipping containers. Within 30 seconds, the entire loading bay had emptied except for Jake, and his unlikely companion, Rex, settled down next to the ship with a contented rumble, completely ignoring the chaos he'd caused. His massive head rested on his front paws like a dog waiting for its owner to come home. The sight would have been almost cute, if not for the rows of razor-sharp teeth visible every time the creature yawned. Jake's communicator crackled to life. Before he'd even shut down his engines, Thompson. The voice belonged to Bill Hayes, Frontier Station's gruff commander. "What in the seven hells is that thing doing on my station?" Jake activated the external camera and grinned at the screen, showing Bill's red face in the control tower. The commander looked like he was about to have a heart attack. Behind him, other station personnel pressed against the windows, staring down at Rex with a mixture of terror and fascination. "Afternoon, Bill," Jake said casually, as if giant predators followed him around every day. "Rex here is just stretching his legs. Long trip from the outer rim. You know how it is, Rex." Bill's voice went up an octave. "You named it. Thompson, you've completely lost your damn mind. That thing has killed thousands of people. Entire colonies have been wiped out by those monsters. Jake glanced out at Rex, who had started grooming himself like an oversized cat. The tongue was the size of a surfboard, black and rough as industrial sandpaper. He's not a monster, Bill. He's just been hungry and lonely. Haven't you ever been hungry? Hungry doesn't excuse genocide, Thompson. Maybe not, Jake admitted. But he's been following me for 3 weeks now, and he hasn't hurt anybody. Actually, he's been pretty helpful. That was the understatement of the century. Rex had proven to be better than any security system Jake could have bought. Pirates took one look at the Shadow Maw and decided Jake's cargo wasn't worth the risk. Even the most desperate raiders knew better than to tangle with an apex predator. The proof had come just 2 days ago, near the Vega system. Jake had been hauling medical supplies to a colony when the Crimson Dagger appeared on his sensors. The pirate ship was infamous throughout the sector for its brutal raids on cargo vessels. Captain Rodriguez and his crew showed no mercy to traders who couldn't defend themselves. They'd moved in for an easy score, probably expecting Jake to surrender without a fight, like most independent haulers. The pirates had even started their usual intimidation routine, demanding Jake prepare for boarding. Rodriguez himself had gotten on the come, threatening terrible things if Jake didn't comply immediately. That's when Rex had made his opinion known. The Shadow Maw's roar had shattered the silence of space, somehow transmitting through subspace frequencies that every ship in the area picked up. It was a sound that bypassed rational thought and spoke directly to the primitive parts of the human brain that remembered when mankind huddled around fires to keep the darkness at bay. Jake had watched through his rear cameras as the Crimson Dagger's crew scrambled to reverse course. The notorious pirates, who'd terrorized shipping lanes for years, fled like scared children. Their engines had redlined, trying to put distance between themselves and the Shadow Maw. Word traveled fast through the criminal underground. Within hours, every smuggler, pirate, and raider in 3 sectors knew about Thompson's run. The message was simple: stay away. The crazy cargo hauler had somehow tamed a Shadow Maw, and nobody wanted to test whether the creature's loyalty extended to protecting its human friend. Jake's shipping routes had become the safest in the galaxy overnight. Insurance companies were baffled by his perfect safety record. Other traders started asking him for protection, willing to pay premium rates to travel in convoy with the Lucky Strike. But none of that mattered to the terrified dock workers hiding behind shipping containers, or to Bill Hayes sweating in his control tower. All they saw was death incarnate, lounging next to a beat-up cargo hauler, and they wanted it gone. Thompson, Bill's voice had taken on a pleading tone. That thing needs to leave. Now. I've got 3,000 people on this station, and they're all scared out of their minds. Jake looked out at Rex again. The Shadow Maw had noticed the hiding workers and seemed puzzled by their fear. His massive head tilted slightly, yellow eyes tracking the movements of people peeking out from behind cover. There was no malice in that gaze, just curiosity about these strange, small creatures who ran away whenever he appeared. "Give me an hour to unload my cargo," Jake said finally. "Then we'll move along. Rex won't hurt anybody, Bill, I promise." "How can you possibly promise that?" Jake watched as Rex yawned, revealing teeth like broken glass. The sight should have terrified him, but all he felt was a strange sense of pride. He'd done something nobody else in the galaxy had managed. He'd made a friend out of the universe's most feared predator. Because, Jake said, sometimes the scariest things in the universe just need someone to show them kindness. Rex's tail thumped against the landing pad like a contented dog, and Jake couldn't help but smile. The science ship Discovery arrived at Frontier Station exactly 1 week after Jake's encounter with Bill Hayes. It was sleek and white, nothing like the beaten-up cargo haulers and mining vessels that usually docked there. This ship screamed government funding and official business. Jake watched from his quarters as a team of scientists unloaded enough equipment to stock a small research facility. They moved with the careful precision of people who dealt with dangerous things for a living. Cases marked with biohazard symbols, tranquilizer guns that looked like they could drop an elephant, and scanning devices Jake didn't recognize. The team leader was a woman in her 40s with short brown hair and eyes that missed nothing. She wore a standard-issue lab coat over practical cargo pants, but Jake could tell she was military-trained by the way she carried herself. When she approached his ship, Rex lifted his massive head and watched her with those unsettling yellow eyes. "Mr. Thompson," she said, extending her hand. "I'm Dr. Emily Carter, Xenobiology Division. The Galactic Council sent me to study your ... situation." Jake shook her hand, noting the firm grip. "They're calling it a situation now. Officially, it's the Thompson anomaly," Emily said with a slight smile. "Unofficially, half the council thinks you've lost your mind, and the other half thinks you're the most dangerous man in the galaxy." Rex chose that moment to stretch, his massive frame unfolding like some prehistoric nightmare. Emily stepped back instinctively, but Jake noticed. She didn't run. That took guts. "Which half do you belong to, Doc?" Emily pulled out a handheld scanner and took readings of Rex from a safe distance. The device beeped quietly as it worked. "I think you're either the luckiest fool alive, or you've stumbled onto something that could change how we understand these creatures entirely." Over the next few days, Emily and her team set up their equipment in the cargo bay next to Rex. The Shadow Ma seemed fascinated by all the blinking lights and worry machines. He would watch the scientists work with the patience of a cat observing fish in a bowl. Jake found Emily particularly interesting to talk to. Unlike most academics he'd met, she didn't talk down to him or treat him like some backwater cargo jockey. "Who'd gotten lucky?" She asked real questions and listened to his answers. "Tell me about the first time you fed him," she said one evening, as they sat in his ship's cramped galley. Through the windows, they could see Rex sleeping peacefully next to her equipment. Jake described the encounter on Kepler 44 to be how Rex had looked hungry and hurt rather than aggressive. Emily nodded and made notes on her tablet. "Shadow Maws are pack hunters," she explained, pulling up holographic displays that filled the small space with light. "Look at this." The hologram showed creatures that looked like Rex, but smaller and in groups. Jake watched families of Shadow Maws working together, building elaborate dens in cliff faces, caring for their young with surprising gentleness. This was their home world, Kithera Prime, Emily continued. "Beautiful place, rich in rare minerals. The Shadow Maws had lived there for millions of years before we found it." The next hologram made Jake's stomach turn. It showed the same world stripped bare, its surface carved away by massive mining operations. Where once there had been forests and rivers, now only empty pits remained. "The mining corporations moved in 2 centuries ago," Emily said quietly. "They needed the lithium deposits for hyperdrive cores. By the time anyone realized the Shadow Maws were sentient, it was too late. Their entire civilization was gone." Jake stared at the images. What happened to the survivors? They scattered across the galaxy, driven mad by isolation. Shadow Maws are deeply social creatures. Mr. Thompson, imagine if you spent 200 years completely alone, watching your entire species go extinct. What would that do to your mind? The pieces started falling into place for Jake, the way Rex followed him around. The obvious intelligence in those yellow eyes, the almost desperate gratitude when Jake had shared his food. "They became monsters because they forgot how to be anything else," he said. "Exactly. They attacked colonies, not out of malice, but out of broken minds trying to find some connection, any connection, with other living beings. When that failed, Emily gestured helplessly. Rage was all they had left. She pulled up more data, showing brain scans and behavioral patterns. But you changed something fundamental when you showed Rex kindness. You reminded him what it felt like to be part of a family again. As if he'd heard his name, Rex stirred in his sleep. The massive creature made a sound Jake had never heard before, something deep and rhythmic that seemed to come from his chest. It was almost like purring, but much more complex. Emily's instruments went crazy. Alarms started beeping, and her tablet screen filled with data streams. "That's incredible," she breathed, studying the readings. "What's happening?" "He's calling to them," Emily said, her voice filled with wonder. "Shadow moths communicate through subsonic frequencies, below human hearing range. Rex is broadcasting across multiple star systems." The purring sound continued for several minutes. Rex's eyes never opened, but Jake could see the creature's whole body vibrating with the effort of producing the call. It was hauntingly beautiful, like whale song from the old Earth documentaries Jake had watched as a kid. Then Emily's long-range sensor started picking up responses. "There," she pointed at her screen, "and there, at least 3 others answering from different sectors." Her hands flew over her controls, tracking the signals. "They're moving this way." Jake felt a chill run down his spine. "How many are we talking about here?" "We estimate maybe 24 survivors scattered across the galaxy," Emily said. "But if Rex's call reaches them all," she looked up at Jake with an expression caught between excitement and terror. "They might all come." Rex opened his eyes and looked directly at Jake. For the first time since they'd met, the Shadow Moth's expression seemed almost hopeful. The loneliness that Jake had sensed in those yellow eyes was fading, replaced by something else. "They're not alone anymore," Jake realized. Emily nodded. "Neither are you, Mr. Thompson. What you've started here, it's going to change everything." Outside, the first of the responding Shadow Moths dropped out of hyperspace near Frontier Station. Then another, then 2 more. Bill Hayes was probably having a complete breakdown in his control tower, but Jake couldn't bring himself to care. Rex stood up and walked to the cargo bay door, his massive frame blocking out the station lights. He made that purring call again, louder this time, and the responses that came back made the entire ship vibrate. Jake watched through his viewport as shapes moved in the darkness between the stars. Massive forms that had been alone for 2 centuries, finally coming home to something that felt like family. "You know what this means, don't you?" Emily asked quietly. Jake nodded, watching Rex greeting his long-lost kin. "Yeah, it means the galaxy's about to get a lot more interesting." The Shadow Moths were no longer scattered and broken. They were a pack again, and Jake Thompson had somehow become their unlikely alpha. He just hoped he was ready for what came next. The emergency beacon cut through space like a scream in the dark. Jake was finishing his morning coffee when the distress signal reached his ship's communication array, broadcasting on all emergency frequencies, with the desperation that only came from people facing certain death. "This is New Birmingham Colony, calling any ships in range," the voice crackled through static. "We have a code black emergency. The Reaper fleet is inbound with 30 vessels. Estimated arrival in 2 hours. We have no military assets. Repeat, no military defenses. Women and children are being evacuated to underground shelters, but we won't survive a direct assault. Please, if anyone can hear this, we need help." Jake set down his coffee cup and looked out at the 4 massive shapes floating in space around his ship. Rex and his 3 companions had been traveling with the Lucky Strike for the past week, getting used to each other after 2 centuries of isolation. They moved through hyperspace like a pod of whales, graceful and coordinated in a way that still amazed Jake. The Reaper fleet was bad news. Jake had heard stories about them in every spaceport from here to the Outer Rim. They weren't just pirates, they were something worse. Raiders who took everything they could carry and destroyed the rest out of pure spite. Their leader, Captain Vincent Cross, was a former military officer who'd gone rogue after being court-martialed for war crimes. New Birmingham was a farming colony, about 8,000 people, trying to make an honest living growing crops for the inner worlds. They had maybe a dozen security officers and some hunting rifles. Against 30 warships, they might as well throw rocks. Jake activated his ship's external speakers. "Hey, Rex, you hearing this?" The massive Shadow Maw turned his great head toward the lucky strike. Those yellow eyes seemed to understand every word. The other 3 creatures, Jake had started calling them Alpha, Beta, and Charlie, for lack of better names, also focused their attention on his ship. "There are people in trouble," Jake continued, feeling slightly ridiculous for talking. 2 giant space predators like they were his crew, families with kids, trying to defend their homes. The bad guys have big ships and lots of guns. Rex made a sound deep in his throat, something between a growl and a purr. The other Shadow Maws responded with their own vocalizations, creating a harmony that Jake felt in his bones. It was like listening to an alien symphony, beautiful and terrifying at the same time. Dr. Emily Carter had explained to Jake that Shadow Maws were highly intelligent pack hunters, who had once built complex civilizations. They understood concepts like justice, protection, and family better than most humans gave them credit for. The question was whether 2 centuries of madness and isolation had destroyed those instincts entirely. "What do you think, boy?" Jake asked Rex directly. "Want to save some people?" Rex's response was immediate. The Shadow Maw's eyes blazed brighter, and he let out a roar that made every instrument on Jake's ship flicker. The sound carried through subspace frequencies, a battle cry that announced the pack's intentions to anyone listening. Alpha, Beta, and Charlie joined in, their voices creating a chorus that probably scared every living thing within 10 light years. But to Jake, it sounded like acceptance, like 4 broken souls who had finally found something worth fighting for. The journey to New Birmingham took 30 minutes at maximum hyperspace velocity. Jake's ship led the way, while the Shadow Maws followed in formation, their massive forms cutting through the fabric of space-time like living weapons. When they dropped back into normal space, Jake could see the colony spread across the surface of a blue-green world that reminded him of old Earth. The Reaper fleet was already there. 30 ships hung in orbit like a swarm of metal insects, ranging from small fighters to massive dreadnoughts, bristling with weapons. They had the colony completely surrounded, blocking any escape routes. Jake could see smaller craft descending toward the planet's surface, probably advanced scouts preparing for the main assault. "Unknown vessel, this is Captain Cross of the Reaper fleet." A harsh voice came over the communication channel. "You are entering a combat zone. Withdraw immediately or be destroyed." Jake activated his transmitter. "This is Jake Thompson aboard the Lucky Strike. I'm here to help the colonists." Cross's laugh was cold and cruel. 1 cargo hauler against 30 warships. "You've got guts, Thompson, but you're about to get yourself killed for nothing. Turn around and maybe I'll let you live." "Thanks for the offer," Jake replied, "but I brought some friends with me." That's when Rex and his pack dropped out of hyperspace. The 4 Shadow Maws materialized around the Reaper, fleet like nightmares becoming real. Each creature was easily as large as Cross's biggest dreadnought, but infinitely more terrifying. Their midnight black scales absorbed the light from the system's star, making them look like holes cut in the fabric of space itself. The reaction from the pirate fleet was immediate. Jake watched through his sensors as several smaller ships tried to break formation and run. But the Shadow Maws were faster, cutting off escape routes with the precision of apex predators who had hunted together for millions of years. "What the hell are those things?" Cross screamed over the open channel. Jake smiled grimly. "Those are Shadow Maws, Captain, and they don't like bullies." The battle that followed lasted exactly 14 minutes, though it felt like hours to Jake. The Shadow Maws moved through the pirate fleet like deadly dancers, their massive forms twisting and turning with impossible grace. They tore through energy shields that could stop nuclear weapons, their claws ripping holes open like tin cans. But what amazed Jake most wasn't their destructive power, it was their restraint. The pack worked together with surgical precision, targeting weapons and engines, while avoiding crew sections whenever possible. They were fighting to disable, not to massacre. Rex led the assault on Cross's flagship, a massive dreadnought called the Blood Harvest. The Shadow Maw's roar shattered the ship's bridge windows and sent the crew fleeing to escape pods. When Cross himself tried to ram his ship into the colony's main settlement, Alpha and Beta coordinated to catch the dreadnought between them, holding it steady while Charlie destroyed its engines. Down on the planet's surface, Jake could see crowds of colonists emerging from their shelters to watch the impossible battle unfolding above them. Captain Lisa Mitchell of the Colony Defense Force was broadcasting constant updates, her voice filled with wonder. "They're not just attacking randomly," she reported to anyone listening. "The creatures are herding damaged ships away from populated areas before finishing them off. It's like they're protecting civilians." That was exactly what they were doing. The Shadow Maws had positioned themselves in a defensive formation around the colony, making sure that no debris or escaping pirates could threaten the people below. When the last of the Reaper fleet either surrendered or fled into hyperspace, the pack maintained their protective circle. Jake brought his ship down to the colony's main spaceport, where thousands of grateful settlers waited to thank their unlikely saviors. Rex landed nearby, his massive form casting a shadow over the landing pad. The other Shadow Maws settled around the colony's perimeter, like living guard towers. As Jake stepped out of his ship, he saw children pointing up at Rex with wonder instead of fear. The massive predator had lowered his great head to get a closer look at the tiny humans, his yellow eyes gentle and curious. "I don't believe it," Captain Mitchell said, approaching Jake with her hand extended. "For Shadow Maws just saved our entire colony. How is this possible?" Jake looked up at Rex, who was allowing a group of brave children to touch his scales. Sometimes the scariest monsters in the universe just need someone to remind them what they're fighting for. The galaxy's most feared killers had become its most unlikely guardians, and Jake Thompson was just a cargo hauler who had shared his lunch with a hungry friend. But that simple act of kindness had changed everything. The Galactic Council chambers on Terra Nova were nothing like Jake had imagined. He'd expected something grand and intimidating, all marble columns and floating holograms. Instead, it looked more like a corporate boardroom that had been decorated by someone with too much money and not enough taste. Jake tugged at his collar for the 100th time, trying to get comfortable in the formal clothes Dr. Carter had insisted he wear. The shirt was too tight, the pants too stiff, and the shoes made his feet hurt. He felt like a fraud wearing them, like a kid playing dress-up in his father's clothes. Through the massive windows that made up one wall of the chamber, Jake could see Rex lounging in the courtyard outside. The massive Shadow Maw had attracted quite a crowd of onlookers, mostly children who had escaped their parents' supervision to get a closer look at the legendary creature. Rex seemed to enjoy the attention, carefully lowering his enormous head so the braver kids could touch his scales. 6 months had passed since the battle at New Birmingham, and the galaxy had changed in ways nobody could have predicted. Word of Jake's alliance with the Shadow Maws had spread like wildfire through every communication network, news service, and gossip channel from the core worlds to the outer rim. At first, most people had assumed it was some kind of hoax. Were supposed to be mindless killers, not protective guardians who played with children. But as more colonies reported peaceful contact with the creatures, the evidence became impossible to ignore. The transformation hadn't happened overnight. Those first few weeks after New Birmingham had been touch and go, with nervous colonial militias shooting at Shadow Maws who were only trying to help. Jake had spent most of his time traveling between worlds, acting as a translator between species that had been enemies for 2 centuries. It helped that Rex seemed to understand the delicate nature of their situation. The massive predator had an uncanny ability to sense when his presence was causing panic, and he'd learned to stay hidden until Jake could explain things to the local authorities. The other Shadow Maws had followed his example, approaching human settlements with the careful patience of wild animals. Learning to trust again. The breakthrough had come when pirates attacked the mining colony on Kepler 186F. 3 had been in the area, drawn by Rex's calls to rejoin the pack. When the raiders struck, the creatures had intervened without any prompting from Jake, driving off the attackers with minimal casualties on both sides. After that, requests for protection started pouring in from colonies across the frontier. These were places that couldn't afford military protection, farming communities and mining outposts that had been easy targets for pirates and raiders. The Galactic Council had been happy to ignore their pleas for help, but the Shadow Maws had answered the call. Now, 17 colonies hosted protective packs of the creatures. Pirate activity in those sectors had dropped to practically zero. Trade routes that had been dangerous for decades were suddenly safe for even the most lightly armed cargo haulers. Insurance rates had plummeted, and colonial populations were growing as people realized they could build homes without fear of attack. Mr. Thompson, Council President David Morrison called from the podium. "If you would join us at the front of the chamber." Jake walked down the aisle between rows of alien dignitaries, feeling like he was marching to his own execution. Representatives from dozens of species watched him with expressions ranging from curiosity to barely concealed hostility. Not everyone was happy about the Shadow Maw integration project, as they'd officially named it. Morrison was a tall, thin man with gray hair and the kind of smooth politician's smile that never quite reached his eyes. He'd been polite enough during their earlier meetings, but Jake could sense the calculation behind every word. The council saw political opportunity in the Shadow Maw alliance, and they wanted to control it. "Ladies and gentlemen," Morrison announced to the assembled crowd, "the Shadow Maw integration project has exceeded all expectations. What began as an isolated incident has become a galaxy-changing phenomenon." Jake tried not to wince at the formal language. To Morrison and the council, this was all about statistics and political advantage. They talked about integration protocols and threat assessment matrices like they were discussing weather patterns instead of living, thinking creatures who had been driven mad by centuries of loss and isolation. 17 colonies now host protective packs, Morrison continued, reading from his prepared notes. Pirate activity in those sectors has dropped to 0%. Colonial development applications have increased by 400%. The economic impact alone justifies the resources we've invested in this project. The resources they'd invested. Jake almost laughed at that. The council hadn't invested anything except paperwork and bureaucracy. It was the Shadow Maws themselves who'd done all the real work, learning to trust again after 200 years of being hunted and feared. "Therefore," Morrison said, building to his big moment, "it is my great pleasure to announce the creation of a new diplomatic position. Jake Thompson will serve as the first human Shadow Maw ambassador, with full authority to negotiate on behalf of both species." The applause was polite, but lukewarm. Jake could see the reporters in the gallery frantically taking notes, probably already writing stories about the common cargo hauler who became an interstellar diplomat. The whole thing felt surreal, like something that was happening to someone else. They gave him a fancy office in the council building, complete with a view of the city and a salary that was more money than Jake had ever imagined earning. There was even a parking space reserved for Rex in the courtyard, with a small plaque that read "Reserved for Ambassador's Security Detail." But the real reward wasn't the office or the money or the official recognition. It came later that afternoon, when Jake watched Rex interacting with a group of young Shadow Maws who had recently emerged from the deep space where they'd been hiding. The younger creatures were still skittish around humans, their minds scarred by generations of conflict and mistrust. But Rex had become their teacher, showing them how to approach the tiny, fragile beings who had once been their enemies. Jake watched the massive predator demonstrate how to lower his head slowly, how to make the gentle rumbling sound that meant friendship, how to be patient when humans needed time to overcome their fear. It was like watching a grandfather teaching his grandchildren how to be gentle with a new pet. The older Shadow Ma would nudge the younger ones with his nose when they got too excited, or position himself between them and any humans who seemed nervous. His patience was endless, his understanding of both species remarkable. Jake found himself thinking about that first day on Kepler 442b, when he'd tossed a protein bar to a wounded, starving creature who had every reason to hate humanity. He'd never imagined that simple act of kindness would lead to all this. A reporter caught up with him as he was leaving the council building that evening. She was young and eager, the kind of journalist who still believed she could change the world with the right story. "Mr. Thompson," she called, jogging to catch up with him. "Can you tell us how you did it? How did you turn the galaxy's most feared predators into protectors?" Jake paused at the entrance to the courtyard, where Rex was settling down for the night. The massive Shadow Ma had positioned himself where he could watch both the buildings, entrances, and the street beyond, a perfect defensive position that would let him respond to any threats. "I didn't turn them into anything," Jake said finally. "They were always protectors. They just needed someone to remind them what they were protecting." The reporter scribbled notes frantically. "But how did you know they wouldn't kill you? How did you overcome 2 centuries of hostility?" Jake looked up at Rex, who had raised his great head to listen to the conversation. Those yellow eyes held warmth now, instead of the desperate hunger Jake remembered from their first meeting. "Sometimes," Jake said, "the scariest monsters in the universe just need someone to show them they're not forgotten. Everyone deserves a second chance, even if they've made terrible mistakes in the past." Rex made that deep, contented rumble that Jake had learned to recognize as approval. The sound carried across the courtyard, and several other Shadow Maws answered. From their positions around the city, they were no longer alone, no longer the last scattered survivors of a dying species. They were a family again, and Jake Thompson was the unlikely human who would help them remember what that meant. As the reporter walked away, Jake climbed onto Rex's massive forearm and settled against the creature's warm scales. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new colonies to protect, new bridges to build between species that had been enemies for too long. But tonight, a cargo hauler and a Shadow Ma sat together under alien stars, proof that kindness could triumph over fear, and that sometimes the simplest gestures could change the entire galaxy. Rex's purring vibrated through Jake's bones as he drifted off to sleep, safe in the protection of the universe's most unlikely guardian.